Hi, I'm Tom Carlo, General Manager of KPBS. Thank you for joining us, and I hope this finds you all safe and healthy. And welcome to our very first virtual community conversation, part of our partnership with the National Conflict Resolution Center. And we are so grateful for this opportunity to address a topic so important to our region, the crucial role of the census in a pandemic age. We encourage you to participate by posting your comments and questions during the event. And to learn more about upcoming community conversations, please visit kpbs.org/communityconversations. Community Conversations is made possible by our generous sponsors, Rady's Children's Hospital Auxiliary and California State University San Marcos. And on behalf of all of us at KPBS, I thank you for participating in the conversation. It has been our privilege to serve San Diego since 1960 with news and information that makes us think, help us dream, and keeps us connected. We're in this together, and I appreciate your support, and thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank all of you for joining us in our first virtual community conversation. My name is Steve Dinkin, President of the National Conflict Resolution Center. During this time, NCRC has been working hard to bring virtual trainings and virtual conversations to the community to help discuss some of the challenging issues that we're all facing. And I just want to take a moment to thank KPBS. They've been such an amazing resource for all of us, bringing us news and information to help address some of the most serious issues that we're all facing during COVID-19. Well, tonight, we have the opportunity to have a panel discussion on the Census 2020 in the time of COVID-19, led by Pat Finn of KPBS. Following the panel discussion, you all will have an opportunity to stay engaged and ask questions and enter into this discussion. And if you remain interested in this topic, toward the end, we'll announce ongoing community conversation led by an NCRC facilitator to get more in depth into the issues of community and the Census 2020. So with that, I wish you all to stay safe and healthy during this time. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. You can tell this is our first virtual community conversation, I think, but I would like to welcome all of you tonight. It's going to be an interesting and informative evening. It is an evening co-sponsored by KPBS and the National Conflict Resolution Center, and we are having our community conversation on the census. It's titled The Crucial Role of the Census in a Pandemic Age. And we're going to learn a lot tonight. We're going to learn how the census works, how the data is collected, what is it used for, and we will learn what the challenges are in counting every single resident of the United States during this pandemic. So joining me this evening are three guest panelists. The first is Tom Wong, Professor of Political Science at UC San Diego. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you for having me.
And Griselda Ramirez. She is Director of Civic Engagement at the Mid-City Community Action Network. And there she is, Griselda.
Thank you for having me.
And Jeff Enos, who is Deputy Regional Census Manager for the U.S. Census. Welcome, Jeff.
Good evening and happy Earth Day.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Great. So the panel, I'm going to explore with the panel their perspectives on the importance of the data collected, how it will affect the daily lives of all of us, all Americans, San Diegans too, what is being done to overcome the fear that some people have of participating. Mm-hmm. And then it's going to be your turn to ask questions or make comments. So we're going to start with Jeff, the expert on the census, obviously. So Jeff, if you would start us off with some basic facts, what information is collected? How is it gathered? I know the census has been going on a little while right now. What's it used for, and how important is it really?
Sure. So the census is mandated by the Constitution The census has been done every 10 years, starting in 1790, in fact. The constitutionally mandated purpose of the census is to provide apportionment for the House of Representatives. There's a lot of other reasons why the census is important. One of them being the resources and funds that are distributed to communities across the country. For example, hundreds of billions of dollars of federal funding is distributed to communities across the country based on the census count every year. So when we're talking about the census being done once in a decade, once every 10 years, we're talking about trillions of dollars of federal funding distributed to communities across the decade. So that makes it extremely important to assure that communities across the country receive the funding that they need and they deserve. As far as what's asked on the census, it's 10 questions, takes less than 10 minutes. We ask how many people live in the household, names, ages, Hispanic origin, race, how people are related within the household, and if they own or rent the home. And that's pretty much it. We don't ask citizenship. We don't ask citizenship status. We do not ask immigration status. The census does not. The 2020 census, we do not ask any questions about income. It's really simple. Also, it's really easy to participate. You can respond online at 2020census.gov. You can respond by calling a toll-free phone number, or you can fill out the paper questionnaire and mail it in.
Is there or is there not a question about citizenship on the census?
No, there's not a question about citizenship. There's no immigration status question. No question at all about citizenship status or immigration status.
And where are we in the process right now? I mean, has the pandemic, the COVID-19, interfered with collecting data?
So first of all, the ability for people to self-respond has not been impacted very much. Everyone that has received an invitation or a questionnaire can still respond, and we're seeing that the responses are actually right on line with the projections pre-pandemic. Actually, nationwide, we're over 50% of households have already responded to the census. In California, I believe it's about 51, 52%. And San Diego County, it's actually a little bit higher. So the ability to self-respond is still ongoing. Some of our field operations we have had to postpone in order to protect the health and safety of our employees and also of the American public. But we are planning later this spring and this summer to go back out into the field once it's deemed safe to collect, finish the census, and we're planning on finishing it October 31st.
Okay. But so Tom, I think there are still worries, even with this assurance, that undocumented immigrants and others may not participate in the numbers that they really represent in the census. What are their concerns? Why are they not going to participate, do you think?
Yeah, well, thank you again to KPBS and the National Conflict Resolution Center for putting this together in the midst of our current pandemic. I think this is an incredibly important conversation. As Jeff mentioned, we're talking about billions of dollars that go to states and localities. We're also talking about political power. And so when we are thinking about the question of undocumented immigrants participating or not, and more generally non-citizens participating or not, this is one of the sort of longer fights that the Trump administration has fought in its broader immigration agenda. So when we think about the census, we're talking about all persons presently residing in the United States being counted. And all persons includes individuals who are non-citizens, undocumented, etc. And so when we think about the sort of money aspect of counting, we can kind of put that aside and think about, well, if there's an undercount, then maybe certain states, certain localities will receive less federal funding. But there's another aspect to the census, which is the apportionment of also political power. And so when we think about the apportionment of political power, we're thinking about using the census count to actually figure out how to draw maps for 435 House districts across the country. And so if there's an undercount in places where there are large populations of non-citizens, then places like California, New York, Illinois, those immigrant destination states could potentially not just lose money and resources, but can also lose political power, lose that voice in Congress through a House representative. And so there was a fight that was fought over the course of more than a year that led to the Supreme Court saying no citizenship question. But there are many who believe that the damage was already done. The seed that was planted, that the census could potentially be used to identify undocumented immigrants, that seed was planted. And so even though that there is no citizenship question right now, people still are concerned, not just undocumented immigrants, but also individuals in mixed immigration status families. When we're thinking about those 10 questions that Jeff mentioned, imagine if you are a US citizen child of undocumented parents. You're being asked to say, here are my parents, male, female, date of birth, etc., who live in my household. And that can have a chilling effect for a US citizen filling out the census. And so just to add a little bit more meat to the conversation, San Diego County, we have an estimated 211,000 undocumented immigrants. And if, for example, we get half not participating in the census, estimates vary because it's hard to pin these numbers down, but we could potentially lose between $1,000 per person to $2,000 per person for an undercount of the undocumented population. So if we're talking about roughly 200,000, we have that for non-participation, and we say $1,000 to $2,000, then we're talking about potentially San Diego County losing $100 billion to $200 billion when it comes to resources that do things like education, healthcare, the foster care system, etc. And so here in San Diego, we actually ran a survey experiment. We surveyed undocumented immigrants, and we randomly assigned individuals to a control group and a treatment group. The control group had language about the census and a question about participation. And in that control condition, only 1/3 said that they are likely or very likely to participate in the 2020 US Census. Now, there are certain things that can be done right now that I don't think will be done, but I hope folks like Griselda and others will continue to push for.
That's exactly what I was going to move to right now is Griselda, who's very involved in getting people to participate. So Griselda, can you jump in here and tell us what Mid-City Can is doing to make people less fearful and be comfortable answering?
Well, we're definitely encouraging our community to complete the census before the deadline, either by mail, phone, or the internet, so that they don't have an enumerator come to their door, just because of the whole rhetoric of, the fear behind it. Because a few months back, there was some folks scamming people. We don't necessarily know who's coming to their doors, and we just want to make sure that our communities are safe. So by letting them know that it's important to complete the census by mail, by phone, or online as soon as possible, and that way they can avoid folks coming to their doors. So that has been what we've been advising our residents, and they are committing to completing the census, and we're just making sure that we're answering all of their questions.
Well, what are you telling them about why it's important to do it in the first place?
Well, it's important because of resources. Our community, our communities need resources. We need funding, and then also because the City Heights, it's potentially could have an undercount of 83,000 folks because they're considered hard to count. So then we could lose representation, and representation matters to our communities. And that's what we have been telling them. And especially now in this time of the pandemic, it's even more important for those resources to come into our communities.
Well, maybe one thing we did kind of skip over, and maybe Jeff, you can help us fill in this blank here. What exactly what kind of resources are we talking about? Because in addition to congressional seats, Tom referred to billions, maybe billions of dollars. What is this money for? Where does it use? How does the city or state get to receive it?
Sure. So the Census Bureau doesn't distribute any money, but
No.
the leaders of our country, leaders of the state of California, leaders of San Diego County, our funds are distributed to the state of California, to San Diego, based on population numbers, based on census numbers. So it gives leaders information to make informed decisions, to be able to decide where funds need to go. For example, we're in a pandemic right now, where funds need to go for hospitals, where emergency funding, also schools, looking at the census data. Okay, there's a lot of young children here. Maybe we need a new elementary school, where the infrastructure needs to be improved, roads expanded, bridges built, etc. So I mean, we can go on and on about all the different areas funding is determined based on census data.
Right. So it is crucial for almost every aspect of life in the United States. So as Tom and Griselda referred to the political climate, given that and the anti-immigrant rhetoric, as well as COVID-19, if you do have an enumerator trying to go out, or enumerators going out and taking the data from people, what are they going to be able to do to overcome fear and reluctance, like even to answer the door? Have you got strategies in place?
Yeah, very fair question. So a few things. The first thing, what we've done is, going back about a year, we began hiring partnership specialists. These are individuals who work in the communities. They build relationships with community leaders, such as Griselda, such as Professor Wong, because ultimately, us as the Census Bureau, we're the federal government. We tell people to fill out the census. They may not want to do it, but when they're hearing from their local leaders, these trusted voices at the community levels, they're the ones they're going to trust, that if they say it's okay, it's safe to answer the census, that they're going to listen. So that's one way. We've hired over 50,000, I believe 53,000 partnerships. We have 53,000 partners across the state of California. These are nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, local government, local media organizations, different organizations that work with communities, work with the hard to count populations, to work closely with them to let them know, hey, it's important to fill out your census form. Please fill out your census form. So additionally, the way that we recruit at a very micro geographic level to make sure that we're hiring neighbors to enumerate neighbors, recruiting in multiple languages, recruiting individuals who will work in their own neighborhood, so we're not traveling people around to get the job done, but having a neighbor enumerate their neighbors, so to build on that trust. And ultimately, we also have a large marketing campaign, a large advertising campaign that the Census Bureau is working with local media outlets to get the word out about the census and to encourage participation. Those are kind of three of the major ways that we're trying to reach out to the population to assure that they participate in the census.
I saw a question fly on the bottom of the screen, which asked, is the data collected protected from ICE?
Oh.
Is it? Oh dear.
As Jeff gets his mic.
Okay. Yeah. So.
Okay.
Yeah. So the census data is. Can you hear me?
Sort of. You're kind of breaking up, but just persevere here. Well, maybe Tom, maybe you can take that.
Yeah, so I think what Jeff might have started with is that Census Bureau employees take an oath to protect the confidentiality of the data. And so this is Title 13 of the US Code, where you have
Can you hear me?
a $1,000 fine and potential 5 years imprisonment. So I think just to round out that answer, I think part of the concern, though, is that after the citizenship question fight in the Supreme Court, President Trump issued an executive order called Collecting Information About Citizenship Status in Connection with the Decennial Census. And so this was an effort by the Trump administration to get citizenship data on individuals without having to ask a citizenship question. So yes, even though you have Title 13 of the US Code and that $250,000 fine and potential 5 years imprisonment, you still have the political backdrop of Census 2020, which began with a citizenship question fight and then led to an executive order where potentially the administration will still be able to get citizenship information about individuals without having that citizenship question asked on the census.
Okay. The last question I have is kind of it's a big one, actually, and it involves the doctrine of one man, one vote. You know, and that's supposedly what we have in this country, where everybody who can vote can vote and be represented. But if people are not counted, how does that interfere with the one man, one vote doctrine? Let's go back to you, and then maybe Griselda can talk about the importance of voting in congressional districts and what it means to us.
Okay, thank you. So I think a couple of brief points. When we have an undercount, we're talking about in the state of California, programs like Medicare, SNAP, also programs like housing assistance, the National School Lunch Program, and as I mentioned previously, foster care. A broad range of programs are affected by the census. And so if we do have an undercount, it's not just one person, one vote, but it's also everybody in our communities potentially having the resources that need so that they can achieve their full potential. And so that is one reason why we need an accurate count. But that second point that I want to make related to one person, one count, there are potential ways that the administration can help increase participation among undocumented immigrants. And so if we think about the desire to count everybody so that resources can be equitably distributed, as well as political power be equitably distributed, well, for that survey experiment that I mentioned earlier, when we have individuals in that control condition, only 1/3 say that they are likely or very likely to respond. But every census over the last several censuses, so we're talking about decades, there has been a conversation between the Commerce Department and the Census Bureau, and the Commerce Department and an immigration enforcement agency. Prior, it was INS, now it's ICE, about not halting immigration operations, but to think about the large-scale operations like worksite enforcement actions and minimizing those during the census enumeration period. Because there's a very vivid example, Jeff may be aware of this, back in the 80s when there was a large-scale worksite enforcement action during the census enumeration period that had a chilling effect on response rates. And so what we did was in our treatment condition, we said, well, what if this same kind of conversation happens again that leads to a temporary, again, not just of routine operations, but of these large-scale ICE enforcement operations? What if those are temporarily put on hold during the enumeration period? And we get an 8% increase in the likelihood of responding. And so if we are interested in making sure that all San Diegans and all Californians have the resources that they need to fulfill their own potential, then why not do these things, like have a conversation between Commerce and ICE so that we can get at least an 8% increase in participation while letting groups like Mid-City Can and others, the Count Me 2020 coalition here in San Diego County, having them sort of increase using their sort of authentic messenger relationship with organizations, having them work on the ground to increase response rates even further. Because absent those efforts, we will likely see not just an undercount, but a severe undercount, thus undermining the premise of your question, one person, one vote, but also San Diegans won't have the resources that we need and arguably deserve.
Right. Griselda, is there anything you can add to that?
I completely agree with Tom. I did want to add that organizations like Mid-City Can, we have been doing this work for a while to build trust within our community so that the residents within our community could trust us, trust our message, and that has been really working with the members of our community because it's really receptive. They know who Mid-City Can is when we come to their door or when we're calling them, and they're thankful for our phone call. And because we are explaining, we have a conversation about what it really means, and take our time to explain the process of what getting counted and having an accurate count will mean to our community.
Well, we've had a couple of questions. I noticed that kind of display a suspicion or lack of trust. Well, how do we, yes, they take an oath, but how do we know? So I assume you, Griselda, are encountering that sort of sentiment yourself.
Yes, and we advise our community that that the responses to the census are protected by law and cannot be shared with or used by any other government agencies. Answers cannot be used for law enforcement purposes to determine eligibility for government benefits or immigration enforcement. So that's something that we make sure that we let people know.
Okay, and then Jeff, one last point. A high school student asked, well, what if you don't have the internet? I know you've kind of answered that already, but there are a number of people that are, you know all about the digital divide, and so you want to just reiterate?
Yeah, so this is the first census that's been online, and you can respond, and we encourage people to respond as much as possible at 2020census.gov. But also, if you don't have the internet, you can respond via a toll-free number at 844-330-2020, or you can fill out the paper questionnaire that's you receive in the mail as well. And I want to emphasize that it doesn't have to be a desktop computer. It doesn't have to be a tablet. It can be on a smartphone. You can respond to the census. It's simple. It's 10 questions. It takes less than 10 minutes to respond. So we try and make that as easy as possible for people to respond. Well,
great. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this part of the program. I want to thank Tom and Griselda and Jeff for an enlightening discussion. And I am going to turn over this program to Kathryn Shade. She's the Senior Project Manager for our partner in this, the National Conflict Resolution Center. Thank you very much. And take it away, Kathryn.
Hi there. Thank you, Pat, and thank you to our panelists. I'm Kathryn Shade with the National Conflict Resolution Center, and you're joining us on Facebook Live. What we're going to do now is we are going to take questions from you, the audience, to be answered by our panel of experts. This is your opportunity to express your concerns or to ask any questions that weren't addressed by the panel discussion. If you'd like to ask a question, just go ahead and post it in the comments box, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can over the next 30 minutes. For our panelists, when you hear a question that you feel that you are suited to answer, just go ahead and raise your hand, and I will address the question to you. Okay, so our very first question comes from a local high school student, and that question is, are there fake census sites? And if so, how can you tell if you are on the real one? Who would like to answer that question for us? Thank you, Jeffrey.
So it's very possible that there are fake census sites. You can know that the real one, there's only one census site. It's 2020census.gov. It's the only site there is. That's the legitimate census site. If it doesn't end in .gov, then you might be going somewhere fake. So make sure you're going to 2020census.gov.
Great, thank you. That is great information. So our next question comes from Parina B. And her question is, what can we do to help undocumented immigrants feel safe in order to complete the census?
I can.
Thank you, Dr. Wong.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I am also on the California Census Complete Count Committee, so I am talking not as representative of the California Complete Count Committee, but just Tom Wong, professor. I think that there is a variety of different interests, whether it be monetary or political power, as we discussed, to encourage people to take the census. But I think there are also difficult conversations to be had by organizations within organizations about how much they push when it comes to getting people who are concerned about participating to actually fill out that census. Because at the end of the day, I think what some of the comments were sort of hinting at is that there is, despite assurances about confidentiality, there is a broader sort of political context that undocumented immigrants are currently living in. And so if there's a person who is concerned about being deported or having family members detained or deported, then I think that there, in this particular census, is a dynamic where organizations may want to push. There may be a break at some point in terms of not pushing too hard. And in so many different conversations across the board, there's heterogeneity. There's some undocumented immigrants that we have called through my center at UCSD, encouraging them to participate in the census. And they get the point about resources and political power, and they are more than happy to do their part. There are others who express skepticism. And so what we do when we hear skepticism is we repeat some of the important aspects of the census one time, and then we pull back. Because at the end of the day, we don't want to make people do things that they are uncomfortable with when it is potentially imprisonment and immigration detention, potentially deportation of a loved one that they are concerned about.
Thank you so much. And Griselda, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would like to add to that. As for Mid-City Can, we've had conversations with folks when we were going door to door, and folks were like, well, I'm undocumented. And we tell them that it's still really important for them to get counted. And what has really worked for us has been the relationships and the name recognition that Mid-City Can has been building for the last 4 years within our community. So when they hear it from us, then they trust that message. And just making sure that, explaining thoroughly why it is really important and for them to get counted.
Thank you so much. The next question is for Veronica C., and it is specifically for Dr. Wong. Professor Wong, how were you able to determine that there were 211,000 undocumented immigrants in California when undocumented immigrants are less likely to fill out the census?
Yeah, so that, thank you for that question. And when we think about estimating populations, census microdata are the gold standard for researchers like myself. When we think about estimating the undocumented population, we sort of begin with an assumption that there is an undercount. And when we think about undercounts, we can actually model the extent to which a particular population, whether it be by race or ethnicity, whether it be by individuals under the age of 5, may have been undercounted. So when we think about the actual data that come in, and then when the Census Bureau and Jeff and his colleagues, maybe some of the data crunchers that Jeff works with, think about other potential sources of information that they can use to begin imputing data, so filling in those missing blanks, then we get a more complete and sort of accurate picture. So when we have that more complete and accurate picture, and when the census signs off on it, that's when microdata become available to researchers. So it's not, Griselda Ramirez and Jeffrey Enos and Tom Wong in a data set. It is, here's a person who lives in a particular place, and here are the characteristics of that person, only up to a certain level. So we don't drill all the way down below what's called a public use microdata area when we are analyzing microdata. So in other words, the census ensures that the data that researchers can use can't actually pinpoint an individual. So that's to protect all of our confidentiality. So we use that microdata to then estimate the characteristics of, as well as the size of the undocumented population. So there are different estimation techniques, but in general, just think to yourself, you have the Census Bureau putting in the work to make sure that we can trust the data that we're getting. We have data about citizens, non-citizens, et cetera, and we use that data to then think about the characteristics of maybe somebody who is a H-1B visa holder and their employment and the job that they work in versus somebody who may be undocumented with a very different type of profile. Now, that's how we get the numbers, but it is really, really, really important to note and to emphasize that these data don't come from the decennial census because, again, citizenship is not a question asked on the decennial census. But the census does the American Community Survey, a 1% sample of the entire population annually. And I hope the census continues to do the ACS annually. We got to kind of wait for congressional appropriations for that, though. But that's when more questions are asked about citizenship, if you're an immigrant, when you came into the country, so how many years you've been in the US, et cetera. So that's the general overview of how we get these estimates. And if you don't remember any of that, just think these are estimates made upon estimates. So take that for what it's worth.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from a local high school student. How old do you have to be counted?
As long as, so as long
Thank
as you
you,
were
Jeff.
born, sorry. So as long as you were born on April 1st of 2020 or earlier, you're counted. So the census count is a count of the population of where you were living and who was living at your address on April 1st of 2020. So you could be 0 days old, be born on that day, or you could be 130 years old. It's everyone, regardless of citizenship or immigration status, regardless of age. It's a count of everyone living in the United States as of April 1st, 2020.
And we have to make sure that we're counting our children because for so long they have been undercounted. Folks count the adults in the household, but do not count our 0 to 5-year-olds. It's really important.
Thank you very much. Our next question comes from Amanda L. And her question is, do you think socioeconomic factors will disproportionately affect certain demographics in a way that cannot be corrected? We'd like to talk about the socioeconomic factors. Thank you, Jeffrey.
I will try. So one thing that we know just from doing censuses every 10 years, doing different surveys like the American Community Survey, which Dr. Wong referenced, is that certain populations are more likely to respond to surveys and censuses. And some of the factors are, some of the characteristics are renters, low income are less likely to respond. Minority groups are less likely to respond. Like Ms. Ramirez mentioned, children 5 years and younger a lot of times are missed. So there are factors that impact response. So what the Census Bureau has done to kind of mitigate that as much as possible is, like I mentioned earlier, we have these employees called partnership specialists. We work in the communities specifically with the types of organizations that service these populations so that we can mitigate that impact as much as possible to assure that we get a full and accurate count of all populations.
Thank you very much. Yes, Dr. Wong.
Thank you. I just want to add briefly in terms of the socio part of socioeconomic, because when we think about enumeration, the counting of people, those partners that were mentioned are incredibly important, not just because of the trust that they have in their communities, but also when we think about one of the hard to count populations, we're also thinking about people who are limited English proficient. We know people who are limited English proficient because of surveys like the American Community Survey. And we know the number of individuals who don't speak English well by the language that they actually speak. And so when we think about enumeration, this is where now it's not just about the Census Bureau trying to count, trying to find trusted partners like Mid-City Can and others in the Count Me 2020 coalition, but it's also then about recruiting the broader community as potential enumerators, as the Census Bureau does. It is one of the largest sort of peacetime mobilizations of people in the workforce that we have. It's about saying, if you speak Chaldean, can you help count individuals who speak that language? Because then you are essentially rounding out the bases. The importance of the count from the Census Bureau, the trusted messengers from the community partners, and then the additional language capacity from people in general who want to play their sort of role in this process and sort of leverage the language skills that they have. In a place like San Diego, we are talking about literally dozens of different languages, if not hundreds if we get into dialects. And so this then creates an opportunity for not just all of us who are kind of nerding out about the importance of the census, but the listeners, the viewers more generally, they can also play a role.
Thank you. Griselda, can you also give us your take on that question around the socioeconomic factors?
Yes, keeping in mind that in San Diego, some of the highest rates of hard to count have been identified here in our region. And in City Heights in particular, we have folks, we have over 80 languages and dialects spoken. So what we have been doing, it has been creating right now with the shift, we have been creating virtual meet and greets where your neighbor is talking to you, your neighbor is inviting you to a Zoom call, and there's a conversation of, you know, the census and why it is important. And so it's relational. Since it's relational, people trust their neighbors, they trust their family and their friends, and they're doing it in language, which is even more important. That's what has been working with us and for us with our community, just making sure that, you know, like Tom mentioned, the language part is really important. If someone is talking to you in your language of why it is important, then, you know, people tend to listen.
Thank you very much. Our next question comes from Consuela S. And her question is, why is race or ethnicity important in regard to the allocation of resources? How about we start with Griselda on that one?
It's important because if you think about it, our communities, I'm just going to talk about City Heights here because this is where we're doing our work. We have well, almost all the races, I would like to say, and it is really important because those our community need. It's like the melting pot. It needs the resources. It needs the schools. A lot of folks depend on aid, and then healthcare is really important for our community. And there's a lot of children within our community, so it is important for those allocation of resources to come into a community that is mostly Latino. We have immigrants and refugees, Vietnamese, and just to make sure that everyone has accurate representation.
Thank you. And Jeffrey, can you also answer that for us? Why is race and ethnicity important in regards to the allocation of resources?
Sure. So one of the big reasons is to assure that communities of all colors are being fully represented and supported in the same way as far as funding as the funding is distributed. So I mean, that's ultimately, in my opinion, kind of the main thing to assure that all communities are receiving the resources they need. Different racial groups may have different needs, and to assure that needs for all communities are met ultimately.
Thank you. And Professor Wong, what would be your answer regarding the race and ethnicity issue?
Yeah, thank you. I think one additional aspect is incredibly important and reflects sort of our history from civil rights to present. The numbers that are collected from the census disaggregated by race and ethnicity are used to do things like enforce the Voting Rights Act. So when we think about why we ask about race and ethnicity, it's not just about the allocation of resources, because the allocation of resources are supposed to be blind to whether or not you are a Black person who is sick versus an Asian person who is sick. But when we think about things like landmark legislation, like the Voting Rights Act, when we think about the Voting Rights Act, we start thinking about, well, if there are people, communities of color, in places where they have very little shot at electing a representative who looks like them, then part of the Voting Rights Act is to say that, there may be gerrymandering because we have data on race and ethnicity. And if there were congressional districts drawn another way, for example, then that would actually increase the political representation of people of color. And so the importance of race and ethnicity is, in addition to making sure that individual needs are met, it's also about enforcing landmark civil rights legislation, because in the absence of counting people by race and ethnicity, we can't identify things like voter disenfranchisement targeted at specific groups. And so that leads to a second very brief point. I think the audience should also know that the census and the questions and the categories, they evolve over time. It wasn't until the 70s and advocacy among Latinx organizations that we even got a Hispanic Latino question. And so when we think about the census categorizations, every sort of decennial census, there's a new argument for a potential new category. But we almost got an LGBTQ question on the census. It didn't quite make it. For San Diego, we almost got, and we are kind of far away from though, a MENA question. Because if you are, for example, a person from the Middle East in San Diego, potentially in El Cajon or other pockets of San Diego with resettled refugees, Iraqis in particular, then racially, you have a box that says white. But MENA as being Middle East and North Africa, this is about using our categories, using counting in order to represent people. And as we sort of think about our demographic change over time, undoubtedly there will be groups who are going to say that we need more categories to better reflect the diversity of our populations, so that then when we think about resources being equitably distributed, it's not just in a 5-category lens, that it better reflects the diversity that we see in San Diego County.
Thank you very much. Here's a really interesting question, and this is from Sebastian A. Does the census count those in territories like Puerto Rico? And if the census does count those communities, are there any unique difficulties? Jeff, that sounds like a great question for you.
Yeah.
So I'm in the region. We're responsible for just the Western U.S. So we don't have responsibility over Puerto Rico, but the census is done in Puerto Rico. And unique difficulties. It's an island, and it's pretty much all Spanish speaking. So just having all the forms and all the training and everything in Spanish is really important. Everywhere in the country has its unique challenges. We have unique challenges here in California and in San Diego, as well as Los Angeles and other parts of the state. As far as specific challenges in Puerto Rico, it being an island, and the challenges that they've faced regarding the hurricanes in the recent past couple of years, and with the pandemic, there are definitely challenges there.
Oh, thank you very much. Here is another question. Let's tie this back to question around, again, wealth and privilege. This is a question from Jack T. And this question is, I would like to know if there is evidence that a wealthy or privileged response bias leads to wealthy communities receiving disproportionate government funding. I'd like to jump in on that one.
Sure. I mean, so just talking about how hard to count populations. So hard to count income on the low end of income, low income, poverty areas tend to be harder to count populations, tend to be populations that don't respond to surveys and to the census in as great a percentages as middle income or high income. So if low income populations and other hard to count populations are undercounted, the ending result in that is that areas, wealthy, privileged areas that maybe respond in greater numbers may receive disproportionate government funding. So that's why it's so important that everyone responds and that we really push to get these harder to count populations to respond to the census.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to reply to that question?
Yeah, I'll just say that we know that response rates are higher among wealthier individuals, and that's a great thing, because when you have the sort of privilege to be able to go on the internet and fill out a survey without fear, then hopefully all of those individuals who can do that will do that in Census 2020. But in terms of disproportionate funding to high income geographies, it doesn't really work that way, because when we think about the apportionment of the dollars and we think about the programs that are being funded using these federal monies. So when we think about a program like Section 8 housing vouchers, then this is not necessarily for those with high income, it's for those with low income. If we think about the National School Lunch Program, similarly, if you have the ability to buy lunch, you are now part of that program. And so to the extent that individuals who have the sort of wealth and subsequently the privilege to not have any fear of filling out a questionnaire and giving your information to the government, then that is incredibly helpful to all of our neighbors who may have that fear and who may have more needs than we do when it comes to putting a kid through school and making sure that that kid's not hungry. Our neighbors who are potentially helping with foster care, our neighbors who have medical needs and are accruing medical debt and thus rely on things like Medicare Part B, then those are the kinds of ways that our participation translates into a potential sort of tide that lifts all boats. So to the extent that you're wealthy and you aren't concerned about filling out a census questionnaire, please do that, because that helps our neighbors who are less well off than us.
Thank you very much. Here's another question from one of our local high school students. And this question is, what if you don't have the internet? And I know that you did talk about the fact that workers are going to be going door to door eventually, but some people may still be under the impression that you do have to have the internet. So what if you don't have the internet?
You could actually answer. Oh, go ahead. You could answer by mail.
Let's start with you, Griselda.
So there's this year there is 3 ways of answering. You have mail, online, and phone. So what folks could do is just call a number, and we could put it down in the comments so y'all could have that number, call that number, and you should have received something in the mail by now with the information to make that call and complete the census on the phone. And also you could do it by mail if some households should have received also an envelope on how to complete it and could mail that out.
Great, thank you. Anything to add on that? So here is another question. And this question is from, Darren T. And this one relates to I guess, the federal government and some of the issues going on right now. So what is the impact of the federal government's visa and green card halting executive order moving forward with the census operation? So that is something that is very current. And how do you foresee that may impact the census?
I mean, I think thank you. I mean, I will. I'd love to hear what Jeff has to say, but just very briefly, the language of the executive order dropped today. So now we know what the executive order actually entails. And so when we think about what the executive order is doing, the sort of concern about temporarily ending all immigration isn't what we necessarily got in the executive order. So for individuals, for example, who are in the US and have a visa application in the queue, then it doesn't necessarily affect them. It affects individuals who are outside of the country who are waiting to get in. And so just, a brief description of the executive order, it affects those outside of the country trying to get in, which to me means that it doesn't necessarily affect, from the Census Bureau's perspective, enumeration. But I think on the ground, it's just another kind of way for the administration to use immigration policy, the levers that it has over immigration policy, to potentially further chill the participation of undocumented immigrants in Census 2020.
Thank you very much. And Jeffrey, can you add to that?
Yeah, I would just add that we're a separate agency from ICE, and we do not share our data with ICE. It's against the law for us to share it with ICE. We don't share with any government agency, and that's why it's so important that we work really closely with our partners in the hard to count populations, especially with the immigrant populations, to get the word out that they need to respond to the census, and it's safe to do so. The data is not shared with ICE. It's not shared with any government agency. It's not shared with any company or business, private or public. It's kept completely confidential, and it's important and it's safe.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for answering that question. That actually was one of the questions. It's been difficult to get to all of the questions that have been posed. There have been quite a few of them, but that was one of them. So thank you very much. And, I think that really is about to wrap it up for us. That final question, I think, really sort of puts the period on the discussion that we've been having today about the census in this era of pandemic. There were lots of other questions, and we didn't have time to get all of them. And so what we're going to do now is I would love to just thank all of our panelists and thank everyone for joining us. For our viewers, if you would like to continue this conversation, we're going to have sort of a deeper dive into this topic. You can join us for a virtual community circle, which is taking place on Wednesday, April 29th, from 4 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. And in this community circle, you will have another opportunity to share your unique perspective and to connect with others who are concerned about this particular topic. You can sign up on the link that is going to be shown in the chat box, or that is going to be shown on the screen there. Or you can go onto National Conflict Resolution Center's website, which is ncrconline.com, and join us for that facilitated conversation to continue the conversation around the census and the pandemic. So thank you everyone for joining us for today's community conversation. And thank you so much to our guests. It was very insightful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.